Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barley.
Welcome, Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barley, our resident storyteller, historian, and a man who's fascinated with the blood and guts of British Columbia, the Pacific Northwest. We've talked about railroads a lot, and sometimes it's the railroads which are fascinating. Other times, it's the towns that are built up along them, and that's where we're heading today.
What we're talking about, Mike, is really kind of a sentimental journey for me to a degree. We're talking about Brooklyn, British Columbia to Billings, British Columbia. Now, nobody's heard of Brooklyn, British Columbia, virtually, and very few people have heard of Billings, British Columbia, both named after much more well-known cities. And we're talking about the old Columbia and Western, which is a line sometimes known as the Kettle Valley. It's a CPR subsidiary. And, of course, the Columbia and Western was established, the original idea was established by Fritz Augustus Heinz. When the CPR moved in and bought all his holdings in 1800 and about 96, they bought his Red Mountain Railway and the idea of this Columbia and Western and some of his holdings in Rosslyn and the Trail Smelter and so on. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the old Columbia and Western that runs right from the West Kootenai District, the Arrow Lakes, Brooklyn, right through the high country up over the Blueberry Paulson, down into McCrae Creek, coming along that mountainous, precipitous area, going into Cascade City, and ending up in an old place called Billings.
All right, sounds like a good trip, and there's lots to talk about, so we won't hesitate a moment more. Back after this break with the railway and the towns that grew up around it. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barley, and we're talking about the Columbia and Western Railway line, which the CPR bought. And it went from the Arrow Lakes over west to the boundary country.
Yeah, went right over in the boundary country, ended up really about midway. But we're talking about half of that stretch, Mike. And we'll really start in the West Kootenai District, right on the lower Arrow Lakes. And we start with an old town called Brooklyn. And Brooklyn was established in the summer of 1897, and it was the terminus. It was all the supplies, all the rail, all the crews left from Brooklyn. So a guy named Bill Parker said, well, my gosh, I've been sitting here in a stump ranch, I better make a town out of it, which he did.
And look at the photograph. The stump ranch exists even with the... Why didn't they pull the stumps? I mean, make wheeling in there a bit easier.
They were in such a hurry to get in on the ground floor that they didn't bother about the stumps. The stumps could be pulled later when they had all the wagons and all the teams and the ferry was landing down below and all the rest of it. Didn't work at all. So
Parker, he would have chosen Brooklyn just because he wanted to sound grandiose?
No, just because it was on his land.
And it's his game.
Yeah, he did fairly well. He was the only one who did fairly well because, of course, the line moved on. And as it moved westwards and up the incline, up towards the top of the Blueberry Paulson, what we call the Blueberry Paulson now, Brooklyn was left behind. So 6 months later, all those buildings you see on Main Street and the hotels and so on, the International is still there, but its doors are closed. The Crown Point is gone. There was a Crown Point and Trail as well. So 3 or 4 or 5 hotels in Brooklyn, a whole bunch of stores, and a very, very immediate population. That population dissolved virtually overnight.
Because it just followed the railway along. Yeah, and a new place was going to supply the rest of the country.
So what they did is they built up into that high country, Mike. They get over the top of the divide. They start coming down into the recesses of McCrae Creek. Now, McCrae Creek, we mentioned Scott McCrae many years ago. Scott McCrae was a famous prospector in the boundary country. And he was up that creek looking around for mineral showings and deposits. And as they come down that line, this is very precipitous country, you know, and it's marvelous country. I know it very well. As when I was a kid, I used to fish up in McCrae Creek. And as you went down McCrae Creek, they came into another town called Gladstone, now known as Coryell. But that time it was known as Gladstone. And Gladstone was going to be an instant town, and it was an instant town. They had 1, 2, 3 or 4 hotels, 4 hotels, 3 general stores, and probably 6 or 7 other businesses. So congregation of 500 or 600 people in Gladstone, and they thought it would last, but when the railway moved on by Gladstone, it didn't last. But in between Gladstone and in between Gladstone and Brooklyn,
up over the hump.
So we go back about 4 miles from Gladstone, up the creek. There was a slight widening of the valley in there. It's a beautiful valley, Mike. And they discovered some mineral claims in that area. And they're kind of one side of the railroad and the other side of the railroad. So east and west of the railroad, there were a bunch of mineral claims.
I got a map here. This is a map from 1932. I think it's a 1932 map. Hold that top corner for me, will you? Because this area right here, no, we got to tilt it up. There we go. This is the area, and those are the two mineral claims.
Sure.
Here's the railway line coming right through, and there's the town they put in.
Okay, that's a little town called Paulson. And Paulson really was there to serve these individuals. That's Burnt Basin. Burnt Basin is on the west side, but there's another group of mineral claims on the east side. Yeah. And these claims were, some of them were well-known claims. So you can read some of the names, Mike, and you'll...
Piers Unexpected, Mother Lode, that's a common one.
Mother Lode was quite well-known.
Yeah, the Electric, there's Burnt Basin.
Burnt Basin, yeah.
Mountain View.
Sure.
So that's quite a bunch. What did they find there?
Gold and silver, and very rich deposits of gold and silver again on the surface. Sometimes they drill down 300 feet, 400 feet, and it went down but it was spotty stuff. Yeah. And people worked in this country for years. In fact, old Bill Peerage, which I mentioned on a program years ago, Rattlesnake Bill, they called him in Grand Forks. He was called Rattlesnake Bill, he was called Barbed Wire Bill, he was called Haywire Bill, lots of nicknames. And I remember him well. He was about, I think, 5-something tall. He was about that wide. I think the strongest man in Grand Forks, without a doubt. He was a guy who was bitten twice in one day by rattlesnakes because he used to hunt them. Didn't even bother going to the hospital. And he was probably the only guy in Grand Forks who could get away with that. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, Brooklyn disappeared, and Gladstone vanished. But Paulson didn't. Paulson came really into its own after the railroad came through in about 97. And on either side, those claims, they kept on going back to these claims like a magnet, these prospects. Of course, there had to be a hotel nearby to serve them. Sure. And of course, this was the Paulson Hotel. And the Paulson Hotel lasted right from about...
Or the Hotel Paulson, I understand. That was a little snooty, wasn't it? It had to be that way.
A little grandiose.
Yeah.
And of course, originally it had a liquor license. And when the claims were going well, the liquor license remained open. After a while, they couldn't afford the liquor license. And so they dispensed with the liquor license, but they kept on serving the liquor.
Out the back door?
Oh, sure. My father and my grandfather and all his friends, the Hennigers and the Barleys and the Richies, they all went in there, and they would just serve it off to the side and a little bit of illicit liquor here and there. But the hunters who went in, or the prospectors. Yeah. And it's quite an interesting town. Nothing left of Paulson, just like Gladstone, just like Brooklyn. You can see the old foundations of the old hotel that are there to this day. And kind of an interesting spot. And McCrae Creek is interesting, too.
With all of those claims, how long did that last? How long did the ore last in that region?
Still ore in that region. Interesting, Mike. And I'll allude to that towards the very end of the program. Okay. And there's a lost mine in the area, evidently. And it's quite possible, very precipitous area. And the creek itself has some placer gold, not a lot, but it has some placer gold. So anyway, so we go beyond. We go beyond Paulson, and we go beyond Gladstone. We get into very close to an old place called Fife. And Fife was kind of fascinating. I remember it well as a kid. The Consolidated Mining and Smelting Company, which was the giant mining company of the area, had a big limestone quarry up there. We used to go up there and look at it, and we'd see the old stores up there. Quite a nice Italian community up there.
This is a remarkable piece of work, and this must, I mean, when you realize that you may mention the name Fife once in your life, you want to have an artifact that goes along with it. Who are these regal people?
Well, those regal people are the original royal family of Italy. Yeah. And that was put out by the Mazzacchis, and the Mazzacchi family is still in the Grand Forks area.
And there it is.
Marvelous family.
Mazzacchi noted right there. Yeah. And it says groceries and manware, Fife, British Columbia.
Yeah, well, Mr. Mazzacchi, whose Italian was very good, but his English wasn't quite as good at this time, he put in manwear instead of menswear. Yeah. But that was okay. And it's really quite a nice artifact from old Fife.
Well, it is. And is that the original frame and everything?
Yes.
Yeah. And when you take a look, even the back of these things is amazing because you know it's original because all of the nails here are square sort of nails made by a blacksmith. Yeah. Well, that is a neat piece of... Where did you find... Of all things, the only living artifact with the name Fife written on it.
Actually, I got it from an old friend of mine called Ed Wood and Oliver, and he had a house full of stuff, and I bought most of it.
And that's
over the years.
The Mazzacchi family was one of the people who had a big store in Fife.
Yeah, they had the general store in Fife.
Okay. Now, this open pit and lime quarry, I mean, you remember it as a kid, do you?
Oh, sure. We used to. It was quite overwhelming. It looked straight down into the bottom of the pit, and you couldn't get on the side hill there because you'd slide right down to the bottom. So we were very cautious even as kids of 8 or 9 or 10 years old. And we used to walk up there either through Fife or sometimes we'd walk on the other end through what they call the Bulldog Tunnel, Mike. Now, the Bulldog Tunnel was, if I remember correctly, and I'm not sure, but I think it was around 3,000 feet long. So when you look at the Bulldog Tunnel, and we used to go through the Bulldog Tunnel without a light, of course, because we didn't have any flashlights when we were kids, right? And we go along for a quarter of a mile. We get halfway, and there's a big room dug right into the side of the tunnel. And we used to go in there and see all the dynamite boxes and all the rest. They were empty, but there was a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah.
And then we go right and go for another quarter of a mile and a little more before we got out of the tunnel. It was quite impressive.
It must have been just stone black in there.
Oh,
absolutely,
yeah. Absolutely
stone
pitch black. Sure. We'd have to put the ears down to the track to see if the railway, the train was coming, and then if we felt it wasn't, we were fine. We could have flattened against the wall or headed for the inside of it. In fact, once we did. We headed for that little room. When the train caught us kind of halfway in, we knew where the room was.
That must have been something. The sound of a train coming through a tunnel.
Sure.
And kids.
Yeah, clickety, clickety, click. Very, very overwhelming, powerful sound. And I liked the view from up there because you could see all of Christina Lake kind of out ahead of you, and down below, way down below, and Sutherland Creek and all that. Okay. So this was kind of and the interesting thing about that, Mike, was that it was extremely hazardous when they first put through that Bulldog Tunnel. Fatality after fatality. A lot of them are recorded in what they call the old Cascade record. But
newspaper of the time.
Yeah, it was newspaper of the time.
Well, any reason for that? I mean, why? Or is the railway just a little lax in its safety standards?
The CPR wasn't too concerned about how many men were lost in the building of the Bulldog Tunnel or any of the other tunnels for that matter. Fraser Canyon was an excellent example. And I guess they were afraid of repercussions from the surviving family.
So they just, accident happened.
Sure.
Boom. Take a break here. Be back in a second with more of the story of the towns that were along the Columbia and Western Railway. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. We hardly ever make mistakes, but we made a mistake just a few minutes ago referring to the tunnel as the Bulldog.
Yeah, well, Mike, what we called that tunnel was the Big Tunnel. Why I called it the Bulldog Tunnel, which is miles up the line, I don't know, but it does happen.
All right, well, we've gone through Fife and Brooklyn. Where do we go next?
Okay, we cross the river, cross the Kettle River, Mike, and come into the Cascade Flats. And if ever a town was built for expansion, that was it. Hundreds and hundreds of acres, river on two sides, railroad coming through town. It was going to rival Grand Forks. And really, Cascade got off the mark in 1896. People realized its potential and started moving in 96. By 97, it was booming. By 98, it was a one-day wonder.
It was a roar, was it?
It really was. About 1,000 people in Cascade, 12 hotels. First Avenue was a grandiose street. We touched on Cascade in one other program, but it was really quite impressive. And we had the CPR, of course, had a station there, which was very interesting. And the station, of course, station agent was my grandfather, R.G. Ritchie. And so we had First Avenue, we had Second Avenue, we had Main Street. We had, and another thing which was going to, I think, they thought at the time at least, help Cascade's future and its fortunes, was the building of a dam which would take advantage of the tremendous volume of water coming through the Cascade Canyon.
So this shot here shows the crib work as they sort of started putting in the gravel to do that.
Yeah, yeah, and this was going to lead to a terrific hydroelectric development in there, and they would get in touch with West Kootenai and so on. So they built down at the other end of the canyon, at the entrance to the canyon, they built the massive powerhouse. And you can see the penstock, that is the kind of the pipe tube, coming down. Yeah, we used to slide down there when we were kids right into the powerhouse. And that was when the powerhouse was abandoned. Yeah, we were pretty careful, though.
Well, that must be, that looks like it's about a 60, 80, maybe 100-foot long pipe.
Yeah, about that, yeah.
You must have. What was at the bottom of it?
Well, there was another hatchway, and we could get out of that one if we really had to. But we went right into the powerhouse and dropped ourselves down on the floor and then got back out again.
Now, that's really quite a canyon there. I mean, it's amazing for that canyon to open up into that big flat.
Yeah, and the canyon in high water would produce a lot of water, indeed. But West Kootenai felt that it didn't quite suit their future, and they made an offer to G.K. Stalker, we used to call Uncle Stalker, and he turned it down. And it was a very handsome offer. He'd come in from Spokane, down on his luck, had been a real estate agent, and he turned it down. So that Halloween, all the people in town got together and made an effigy, kind of a model of the canyon and of the dam and of the powerhouse, and he'd turned it down and really had sunk the fortunes of. He thought they were going to come back, they didn't come back, and so they burned the effigy in front of his house, which was called Laurel Ridge. And so the old boy never quite got over that. He was a very fine man, actually.
And the story runs
Yeah.
through the family to this day.
Well,
Uncle
sure.
Stalker
Yeah.
blowing it with West Kootenai.
Yeah, and Cascade, though, you know, in that big year of 1898, before the fires hit Cascade, and certainly they were what we call a 1,000-mile match, because they burned Cascade. First Avenue
They
was burned.
meaning the owners of the properties?
Sure they did. It was the only way to get out. And so a few people stayed behind. My grandfather stayed behind for about 50 years.
Yeah.
And he was actually a post office agent. He was CPR agent. He owned the general store, and the post office I found quite interesting when I was a kid. We'd go in there, and all the little post office boxes were there,
Yeah.
and he would have the scales there and all the rest of
Well,
it.
there you've got a scale here. Is this from that store?
It would be very
Yeah?
similar.
Oh.
No, this would be the type of scales he would use, Mike. And you see on the top part of the scales, it says Canada PO, Canada Post Office,
Yeah.
which is just on the other side. And really very well balanced. And they would have the Canada Post Office weights, which we've got on the box in front of us.
This if I were sending out a pair of hockey skates to somebody.
Sure.
I could just
2
balance
pounds,
them
you'd
off
balance
there.
that. Yeah, very cheap then. You could send a letter for 1 cent.
Now, we've also got a photograph here. Who are these people in this photograph, Bill?
Well, that's my grandfather and grandmother. And I hate to be partisan, but that's taken around 1900. And my grandfather came from a relatively working-class family. My grandmother came from the Holmes family, very, very wealthy. She married what we would consider beneath her station at that time. And so it was rather interesting. She bought a lot of property in Christina Lake. He stayed mostly in Cascade City, had 6 children. And from the Scottish side, 3 of them are redheads. And the interesting thing is, I remember my mother telling me, you know, Mike, it was rather interesting. We were talking about Cascade some years ago, my late mother, and she said she remembered one thing when she was a child, and 2 of her sisters were with her at the time. And the old general store, and I remember it very, very well. You know, the smell of the general store, and there's a special smell, kind of an oily smell, and you look down the old abandoned main street, and there were a couple of buildings across the street, and the old remains of other buildings. This was probably in the 1930s, but her particular memory went back to about 1914, when she was about 10 years old. And they woke up one night because they slept in the upper part of the old general store. And it was a bright moonlit night. And occasionally in the Boundary County, in other parts of British Columbia, you'll have a bright moonlit night. You can literally see for half a mile or a mile extremely well. So for some reason, one of the kids got up and looked out over the balcony and looked down the street and saw some people coming up the street, rolling what they assumed were barrels. And the strange thing was, though it was a very still night, there was no noise. So she woke 2 of the other girls, and they all stood there in the balcony and looked down the street. And there were 5 men, 2 of them rolling a barrel and 2 behind them rolling a barrel, and a man leading them, motioning them to come up the street towards the general store. And what amazed them is when they came up the street towards the general store, now if you believe in the 3rd dimension, they seemed to walk through an invisible wall, and they simply disappeared. So the lead man disappeared, then the barrel disappeared, and the pushers of the barrel disappeared, the second barrel disappeared, and the pushers of the second barrel disappeared. And she remembered it all those years.
The family ghost story.
Well, yeah, I don't know whether you believe in ghosts or not, but it makes a rather fascinating
Well, it
story.
certainly keeps the kids quiet and attracts their attention for a while.
Sure, and one thing I picked up, Mike, the other day, actually, in Old Steveston. No, this thing I picked up
We'll
prior
do that
to.
later. What are you pointing at
Well, I'm
here?
pointing to the spoon.
Oh, the spoon.
Yeah, that's
You
kind of
have to be
interesting.
careful with Bill here.
Yeah.
He points to so many things. Well, look at that. Isn't that spectacular? It's a little cascade. You can just see it
Yeah, it is. It's
embossed
a
in there.
sterling silver spoon, probably around 1915, and says Cascade, BC, gold washed. That was sold out of my grandfather's general store, and I was lucky to get it. I picked it up in an antique shop in Old Steveston.
Yeah.
And along with a number of other spoons. And
These things
are,
too.
These are from Cascade.
You did a little sort of treasure hunting
Yeah, I
there.
did. Yeah,
Now, look at that. Wouldn't that be, because gold, of course, keeps
Yeah.
me fascinated.
Oh, yeah. I picked up over 100 coins and various pieces of jewelry, including a couple of gold rings, that's one of them, in Cascade. And the Americans had got most of it, Mike. But they missed the Main Street part. They missed the old Cascade Hotel, which was a grandiose hotel, and you can see the photograph here. This is the Cascade Hotel in its heyday, probably 1897 or 1898, and this is the Queen's birthday.
Look at
and
that
I went
banner
under,
hanging off
I
there.
went under. I looked at some of these photographs and went under where the original boardwalk had been, and of course picked up all the coins, around 100, I guess.
Yeah.
Some of them were lying right on the surface, Mike, which is rather interesting.
So the Americans didn't get it all. Some of
I
them,
didn't.
some of it you got. Now,
I did.
this right when we saw that that cut in the rock,
Yeah.
that canyon,
Yeah.
that was, I guess, Cascade occurred to a lot of people. The area which became Cascade would be a good place to set up shop, and the native people did that.
Sure. The Colville Indians were there far before the whites ever thought of it. They used to come up from Fort Colville and come up the Kettle River, and they would follow the salmon up, and the salmon stopped at the base of the canyon. They could not get up that canyon. And so they set up, and I never did find their camp, but there was an old sunken canoe down there. There were some artifacts like this recovered from there. There was an Indian burial across the other side. So whether their camp has been washed out by the river, I don't know. But certainly, I remember my grandfather and grandmother telling me how colorful the Indians were coming up on all their beadwork. And they fished in this canyon right till after Grand Coulee was built and the salmon run was virtually destroyed. And of course, you know, when you look at all those old towns, I mean, they've all disappeared. Cascade has a golf course there, couple of houses, about 3 houses is all. But the old town that I knew as a kid has gone, and the town of 1898 that was bustling with teamsters and railroad men and miners. You know, when the railroad men got paid in that town, they didn't keep their pay. They went into a hotel in that town, which shall remain unnamed, Mike, because they would be rolled, very well rolled, and they would
So you
come
mean
out
somebody
the
would rob them of their...
Sure. Oh yeah, well known.
Well, that's the hospitality industry.
number of stories about it too. Number
Yeah.
of stories about it that have been pretty well documented. So Cascade disappeared, but just beyond Cascade, over the long trestle, which is about half a mile away, which went over top of the gorge, came another little town that people have hardly ever heard about, and this was a place called Billings. And Billings, British Columbia, had about 100 people working there. And they drove the logs. Actually, the log runs came right down the river.
This river is filled with big timber.
Yep, bank to bank. These came from the upper Kettle region. And these guys who came down, the log rollers, most of them couldn't swim. If they fell off into the Kettle River, they were gone. But they were so adept at their job, very few of them did drown. So they drove them down to this mill, and the mill pulled them off. And of course, the railroad was right close by. There were 15 or 20 buildings in this photograph. Very few photographs of old Billings. And when you walk by there today, Mike, you would think there had never been a town there.
Yeah.
It has simply vanished, absolutely vanished.
And that's the whole route from
Sure.
Brooklyn through to Billings.
Yep.
2 towns that they had grand hopes for,
Yep.
but it never amounted
Right.
to anything.
Brooklyn vanished, Gladstone gone, Paulson gone, Fife still there, Bulldog Tunnel still in place, Cascade virtually gone, Billings gone. But it's an area you can wander back into, and you know, I find it very interesting because there is a lost treasure story in that area, and probably they say you can see it somewhere above the railroad, just above Old Paulson. And they say, look to the west, over into the Burnt Basin, and it's just beyond Burnt Basin. Whether there's any truth in it or not, I don't know, Mike.
It'll be dollar signs in front of your eyes. Interesting story on the old Columbia and Western route. That's where we've gone today with Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.